Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video in our series, the SoCal Housing Market Update. My name is Stephen Mead with Domicile Real Estate for people who love houses. Want to do kind of maybe a little bit of a monologue, something kind of I wanted to talk about this week, and that is how important perspective is when you're making real estate decisions, and how I think it's probably one of the few things really that people put a priority on. And I think, we do these weekly update videos, and honestly, they are great, and I totally believe in what we're doing. But I also think it's important that sometimes you need to have a perspective that's more than a week to week perspective. And this is the reason why we show graphs for more than the last week, right? Because it's really important to kind of understand where we've been in the market and to have a little bit of a sense of context and reference. I'm reading a book right now that I highly recommend. It's called The Psychology of Money, and it's kind of a rather mundane sounding title, but it's really an excellent book. I think most of the time when we talk about money and finance, people really like to drill down to sort of the math and the hard rules, but the reality is that's not how human beings always make decisions. Sometimes human beings are prone to making stupid, dumb decisions. They make perfect sense in that way that as human beings, we tend to rationalize things, but from a purely mathematical perspective, they don't make a lot of sense at all. And I think it's really important to kind of dive into that. And as an aside, this can be a little bit of a shameless plug, but I'm going to do it anyway. In the real estate world, if you're not working with somebody who's staying on top of what's going on in the industry, staying on top of personal finance and all these trends, and trying to understand how consumers make decisions, how do people make financial decisions that affect their life, I mean, you're really missing out. Your real estate decisions really deserve that level of attention. So if you're not working with someone who is helping you in that way, I think you're really only kind of getting partial service. You're not getting the whole thing. Anyway, let's launch into the stats. We are kind of officially in what I would call a fall market. Yes, I know fall starts September 22nd, but I think for our purposes, the fall market is really that post Labor Day, post back to school market. So let's jump into it, because we actually do have some things that we get to talk about this week that I think are important. So first off, let's talk about our total active listings. Kind of something interesting that happens is that when these levers move in slightly different directions. So if you look here, our under 1 million market, we really went all through the spring with lousy inventory. I don't really know another way to put it, but across our whole market, pretty lousy inventory. Then it sort of accelerated, jumped up, took another jump, and then started to ease off. And now we're kind of resting right around this 6,000 house level. That's roughly 20% more than we were at the bottom. And again, this is for all properties under $1 million. If we look here in our $1 to $2 million category, though, we actually saw that inventory go up a little bit week over week. I don't know if that's really just a blip in the market due to the holiday weekend, but I thought it was kind of interesting. You'll notice that our movements in terms of inventory are a little bit more muted in this $1 to $2 million category. It's kind of interesting to think how consumers, and this is why we break this up into under 1 million and $1 to $2 million, is to really understand how these markets do sometimes move differently, because the consumers in these markets have different motivations. For example, most buyers in the under $1 million market, those are a lot more likely to be first-time home buyers under $1 million than in the $1 to $2 million market. You also notice that in terms of buying what people can afford, most people under $1 million are spending pretty close to their affordability. As we go into $1 to $2 million, we notice people have a little bit more room, a little bit more flexibility. Sometimes people are buying at 1.3, could afford 1.6, but they don't want to. So just kind of some different consumer buying behaviors. I think it's interesting that we did see again that inventory rose up, then it started to drop back a little bit, and it's kind of hitting up. Typically, just to give you an idea of what tends to happen in our fall in Southern California, usually we head into spring, inventory takes a dive through spring as buyers are out there faster than sellers. Then eventually towards the summer, those sellers start to catch up with buyers and we see that inventory rise, it hits a peak usually sometime in September-ish, and then it just kind of falls off towards as we head towards the end of the year. That's our typical inventory pattern in Southern California. And like I said, I'm pleased to report that a lot of the machinations of the current market we're in are starting to feel a lot more like a typical market and not like an exceptional market, which is how I would really describe kind of the last 18 months. Now, if we look at our new listings, I think this is really something important too to note is if you look here, I mean, really, we bounced off this low, but there's not a lot of inventory activity under $1 million. I mean, this is pretty much where we were towards the beginning of the year. I mean, we're right in that zone. And the situation is not quite as dire into 1 to 2 million, but even here, not a huge amount of inventory activity. That is actually fairly normal. Like I said, new homes coming on the market, that tends to trail off as we head into the fall. So not exactly an atypical or an unusual market. Now, if we look at our last 14 days new escrows, you can see pretty market downturn for both of these price categories, under $1 million and 1 to 2 million. What is going on here? Is the market falling apart? No, it's not. We do have a bit of a holiday weekend we're still going through, right? Since this is the last 14 days, we still are covering that holiday weekend. So we've got some things I think that are kind of maybe artificially lowering these numbers. And it is pretty typical, again, for that demand and new escrows to roll off a little bit. If there's one message that I think you can kind of take away from this, if you're kind of looking for the big theme here, the big theme here is that this is a market that is acting a lot more in that rational behavior zone and not nearly as much as that irrational behavior zone. Now, before I start getting comments and emails and things about how, oh no, Stephen, that's not true. There were 36 offers on this house that I wanted to buy. Well, yes, you're still going to see houses like that will attract 36 offers. You're still going to see exceptional houses. But what I'm telling you is, instead of every single house being that way, including the ones that back to the railroad tracks, now those 36 offer houses are going to be the exception, not the rule. And I think that's kind of where we're going, is that we're heading into more of a sort of normal, rational feeling market. So if there's a takeaway from this chart, it's that we're seeing market behaviors that honestly are looking a lot more like what we would expect. If we go down here to our absorption rate, right, this is kind of one of my favorite things to look at. You'll notice that our absorption rate also took a dive in the last week. Now, dive is, of course, a relative term, right? A dive means we are now in the mid 80%, and we're not cresting 90% absorption rate anymore. So what does this mean? This means it is a very brisk seller's market, but it's not a crazy town market. And I think if you're a buyer in this market, that's good. And honestly, I think if you're a seller in this market, that is also good. I've said this a couple times before, but I think it bears repeating. When you have a crazy town, irrational market, that might seem like it's great for sellers, but it really isn't. And the reason why it isn't is you tend to have a lot of buyer fallout. You tend to have a lot of buyer fatigue. You tend to run into transactions that are more likely to end in litigation. When the stakes are high and people are kind of making these irrational decisions, a lot of negative things can come from that. So even if you're a seller and you think it's great that every house gets 36 offers, really it isn't. When I see numbers like these, it makes me think that, yeah, this is starting to feel like more like a normal brisk market. I think we're going to kind of end up in this zone down here. Now, what I think is super interesting that nobody's really talking about, and that I've noticed is, if you look here through the spring, you notice there was generally a pretty decent difference in our absorption rates between our under 1 million and 1 to 2 million, right? Like that under 1 million market was noticeably busier. And then you look here, starting in August, and boy, these numbers look awfully close to one another. That says something about those relationships of supply and demand in these relative price ranges. Now, here's our close prices. Again, just as a reminder, this is 4 to 6 weeks ago. And you see a little bit of an uptick in price at that high end. When I look here, right, it looks like we've really been stagnating for the last couple of months. I think we're going to end the year a little bit higher. You look, it's a little bit more of a gentle curve. And you look down here in this 25th percentile, this is our entry level segment of the market. And look, I mean, that's been a steadier growth over those last couple months. And you might be asking yourself, why? Why are we seeing the patterns that we're seeing? And I think something that I think people need to understand, and this is that word perspective again. We are fundamentally in a housing shortage. So you have to view all of these market supply and demand sort of relationships through that lens of fundamentally, we do not have enough houses for the number of people who need houses. And that's going to mean that we're not going to be talking about a super soft buyer's market. I don't think that's what we're going to see in the next few months. Instead, I think we're going to talk about gradations of just how competitive is it, relatively speaking. How is the inventory? I think these are the discussions that you're going to be having with buyers and sellers, that we're having with buyers and sellers when we're trying to figure out pricing and marketing strategies and offering strategies for the buyers. Let me find my cursor and jump back in here. Okay, if we're looking at this, our percent still active after 14 days on the market. This is yet another kind of instantaneous demand measurement. And when these numbers go higher, that actually means that the market is less competitive. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a word of caution. And, I've mentioned this term holiday weekend several times. We mentioned it back around 4th of July. We mentioned it around Memorial Day. Why is that important? Well, if you look at it this way, let's pretend that for a month period of time, right, that 10 houses are going to come in the market in a particular area, right, and price range, 10 houses. Now, if you have a holiday weekend, what happens is a bunch of people don't put their house on the market that week of the holiday weekend. But those people didn't go away. They just put their house on the market the next week, right? They just wait. And then they all show up one day. And what that does is that may skew this number up a little bit. So I don't think this is quite as dramatic of a climb as these numbers would suggest. But yes, I definitely think there is something there. Now we have our close to list price ratio. And, this really is kind of a fun one for me. And I think there's a lot that you can glean from this and understanding how markets work and the psychology of pricing things. And, what did we notice back here in the spring is, boy, we jumped to this 104% and even above. We didn't even catch the spike here. And then we've started easing back off, which is kind of exactly what we predicted. And what does that mean? It means that finally sellers' perception of what their home is worth is starting to match where buyers are willing to pay. Sellers were basically behind the 8 ball on this, right? Like they're looking backwards towards comps, and buyers are looking at what do I need to do to get my offer accepted. And whenever you have a rapidly rising market, that means that sellers will almost inevitably be behind the times on that information. Buyers will be pricing immediately based on their demand now, and sellers are pricing based on where demand was, a month ago. So finally, I think we're starting to see there being catching up. I think we're going to settle kind of right around that 100% mark. If you look, that's where we were at December of last year. We were kind of right around that 100% mark. So it's nice to see that, again, the market is behaving in kind of a rational way that we would expect. And, markets like that, not to give anyone a false sense of security, but I think markets like that where people are behaving rationally are safer markets than markets where people are not behaving rationally or behaving irrationally. And now we have our days on market, right? And, this is one that we've kind of talked about. And again, I'm going to use that word, perspective. I want you to look at the shape, especially for this under 1 million pricing category, because I think that when you look at this as a whole, going back to December of last year, look at what we had. We had this number fall. It basically reached a bottom right around here sometime in June, and then it is slowly moving upward like this in a parabolic shape. This tends to be the way our days on market graphs look throughout the year. In the springtime, as buyers come into the market, days on market starts dropping as they start snapping up houses and inventory. We get through the summer, things reach a crazy low. And then as we head into the fall, these numbers start to go up a little bit. And notwithstanding this past week, you can kind of see that same shape in our $1 to $2 million pricing category. So again, does anyone want to see these numbers go up to 22, 23 days? Does that mean the sky's falling? No. What it means is we're seeing exactly the type of behavior that we would have expected. Look at last time we were back down in this number was back right around March, the beginning of March is the last time we were at that same days on market number. I think this is, again, a market that's behaving as exactly as we expect. And I think the long-term trend, and I'm gonna bring back a graph here, this pricing graph. I think this really tells you a lot about what you need to know. You can see it illustrated really well here. Prices really took a jump through the spring and then they kind of leveled off. And no matter what price range you're at, there's kind of some variation of that theme, a strong spring and then a slower growth. So, if there was any question, one of the terms that I've been using that people have been asking me about is something I call inflationary growth. And inflationary growth means that your prices are moving, within a percentage point or two of inflation. It means that they're not going up by huge bounds like maybe we saw this spring where it felt like home prices moved 20% in a period of 60 days. And that was a very real feeling. Now let's take a look again at our affordability chart. Again, this really is kind of our canary in the coal mine of are we in trouble? And you can see here, we've just been right between this 110, 115%, really giving wages a chance to catch up to pricing. And just as a reminder, what does this graph really mean? Well, if we look at where payments were on the median priced home, right? Payments on the median priced home back in June of 2018, we use that as a baseline. Where are we today? Well, we're about 113 or 114% of that number in over 3 years. I think that's a pretty reasonable place to be in over 3 years. That really represents 3 to 4% payment growth per year. I think that's a pretty reasonable number to be looking at. Finally, we're going to take a look at our prevailing mortgage rates. They did inch up slightly, but we are still in that under 3% zone. Really, we've just been seeing kind of a real steady state since April in this statistic, which is why we've started charting these. I think that's really aiding a lot to the stability of our market. So I hope that does stick around for the time being. Anyhow, thank you everybody for watching. We love to see your questions, comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. And of course, if you or someone that you know and care about is looking to buy or sell real estate in Southern California, we would very much like to help them out. If you think that there needs to be better decision-making in real estate, if you think there needs to be better knowledge and expertise in real estate, you can definitely support that idea by supporting us. And like I said, we're hoping to have some cool announcements this week. Our first-time buyer market update does come out on Friday. We will see you later on this week. Have a great post-Labor Day week, everybody. Actually, we're post-Labor Day week. Anyway, have a great week. We'll see you soon.